Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being late. We're trying to cover 3 hearings at the same time. So let's get to the key point we're talking about here. No financial institution should be too big to fail. And to me, that means 3 things. If a bank is on the verge of failure, we should be capable of shutting it down without bringing down the entire financial system. The shutdown should not require a dime of taxpayer money, and the shutdown should not create moral hazard by letting the bank's executives escape accountability. Now, the chairman recently introduced a bill that creates a new process for liquidating our biggest financial institutions and repeals the existing process found in Title II of Dodd-Frank. And I appreciate the chairman's efforts, but I'm concerned that his proposal creates more problems with each of the 3 standards that I just laid out. The chairman's bill does not create any established source of short-term liquidity, the point we were just talking about here, for any failing institution, instead relying on the market to provide funding for that failing institution. So just so we got the record clear on this, Professor Johnson, let me ask you, is it realistic to expect the market to provide short-term liquidity for a failing institution in a time of crisis?
No, that would not be a realistic expectation.
All right. And in fact, I thought I heard you say, Professor Jackson, the answer is let the Fed bail them out if it's a short-term liquidity crisis.
No, the failed institution, one of the great advantages, I think, of the bridge company is it immediately transfers a failed institution into 2 different entities. An entity that has business.
I understand that.
Okay.
Professor Jackson, I understand how this works. I just listened to your testimony just now, and you said, gee, if we had a crisis like 2008 and liquidity dried up, as Professor Johnson said, it most likely will in this kind of circumstances.
But it would be under.
You would say, let the Fed take care of it.
It would be under the circumstances where it wasn't directed at the particular institution, but to a broader liquidity problem.
But you're talking about putting taxpayer dollars in, and to me, that's what too big to fail is all about.
Taxpayer dollars into an industry-wide issue that wouldn't distinguish between the institution that was in the resolution proceedings and the ones that weren't.
So in other words, let me just wrap this back around. Professor Johnson, would the chairman's bill just put us back where we were in the 2008 crisis so that Congress would either have to step up with a taxpayer bailout or risk the entire meltdown of the financial services industry and potentially the economy?
Yes, I fear you would have another Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke moment when they come to you and say, if you don't give us a large amount of money with few strings, there will be a global cataclysm.
Well, and I think that's what we're all trying to avoid here. You know, there's one other part to this that I want to talk about, besides the fact that the government the taxpayer should not be put in the position of having to choose between either watching the economy implode or having to bail out these big financial institutions. And that's the question of moral hazard built into this. The chairman's bill lets the CEO and the management team of the bank keep their jobs and all of their past compensation. That's the same sweet deal that the bankers got in 2008. So, Professor Johnson, let me ask, do you believe that the chairman's bill does enough to discourage senior management from taking on big risks that threaten the entire financial system?
I think, Senator, that it does not do enough. I think that was a major issue in the run-up to 2007, and I fear it could absolutely happen again.
Thank you. I know this is a complicated issue, and I appreciate the chairman's contribution to this conversation, but I have serious concerns about any proposal that would once again force Congress to face another bailout decision and would once again let CEOs get all of the upside of taking big risks, but none of the downside on this. I think we need more accountability in this system, not less. So the chairman asked the question about why deal with moral hazard and suggested that to say that bank executives of these large, too big to fail banks, if they bring down an entire institution, should have some responsibility for that. And so I just want to ask the question again. When a big construction company fails, he asked the question, are the executives fired under Chapter 11? And the answer is no. But does a big construction company, if it fails, threaten the entire economy? Professor Johnson?
No, hopefully not.
Hopefully not, at least.
Historically.
Yes, and do we see the Secretary of the Treasury or the Federal Reserve Chair coming in to tell the American people that they need to bail out a big construction company?
No, we have not experienced that.
All right. So I think, and then the question is, does that change the calculus on whether or not we need to find devices in the law for holding the executives of the biggest financial institutions accountable if they threaten to wreck the economy again? Professor Johnson?
I am absolutely in favor of holding them accountable. And just to add a small fact to this, the corporate executives of the top 14 U.S. financial companies made $2.5 billion in compensation between 2000 and 2007. The most compensated 5 of them made $2 billion of that. They were the people who took on the risks of all the big companies that you know very well, the AIGs, Countrywide, Lehman, Bear Stearns. They're the ones who brought down the system. So the moral hazard is front and center of our concerns here.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Johnson. And I just want to go to one other point. And that is, I very much am struck by your point, Professor Taylor, and that is the markets don't believe that if pressed, the United States government would not bail out the too big to fail banks right now. I think that was your point, right? So I want to ask a question. The law right now says that we won't. If we pass 5 laws that say we're never going to bail them out, will that change whether or not the markets believe that if pressed, if the economic system is at risk, if a too big to fail bank threatens to bring down the entire economy, that what will happen is that the American government or the American taxpayer will be put on the hook to bail them out?
Senator, the purpose of this bill, or Chapter 14...
I'm not asking you that question.
Well, that's how I would answer it.
Well, what I heard you say is that no one believes.
With the current bankruptcy law.
All right, let me ask it a different way. In 2008, did we have a law that said that the federal government would bail out the biggest financial institutions if they threatened to bring down the entire economy?
No, we had
no law on it, right? And yet, when faced with the choice of either watching the economy collapse or bailing out the biggest financial institutions, what did Congress do at that point?
They bailed them out.
They bailed out the biggest financial institutions. The question for me, and this was the one that the chairman asked, I understand we're trying to get to the same place. We're not at loggerheads over this part of it. The question is realistically, how do you get there? And for me, that's why things like the living wills are so important and why they intersect powerfully here. It's why regulatory structure is so important. It's why Glass-Steagall is so important. The things that keep us away from coming to the precipice of banks that can bring down the entire economy. So I appreciate the point, and I really do. I'm not trying to argue with you about where we're trying to get. It's just a question of whether or not passing one more law to promise we won't bring down the economy will change, won't bail out big banks, will change anything if we're put in the position of it's either bail out the big bank or watch the economy collapse. And that's the part I'm worried about. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Well, and I think